Please welcome Michael Ruse, who needs no introduction. He's one of the fathers of the philosophy of biology as we know it. He published very widely on Darwinism and lots of other issues, including issues about the conflict or alleged conflict between evolution and religion. And today he's going to talk to us about Darwin and design, the real meaning of the Darwinian revolution.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. If I say this is a serious talk, it is a serious talk. And I've got some ideas which I think are really worth listening to and thinking about. On the other hand, this is not a pompous talk. This is not, like being called in and your headmaster going to tell you off or something like that. I want you all to enjoy this. So it's Darwin and design, the real meaning of the Darwinian revolution. Okay. And so what I think I'm faced with, what I think we're all faced with, is what they call the conflict thesis. That's to say that Darwinism and religion are in conflict, and particularly religion. I'm going to talk only about the Christian religion, and mainly about Protestantism, but I think everything I've got to say is also covered by Catholicism as well. Okay, so the question is it a conflict or not? And if it isn't a conflict, then what the hell is going on? Now, I want to say it's not a conflict, but I think what's going on is a lot more interesting than, two sides like the First World War looking at each other across trenches. So what I'd like to do first is I want to give you sort of for the next 5 minutes or so, a kind of mini introduction to Charles Darwin. And then we can pick up on the story, because it's important to know who Darwin was and where he was coming from. Now, this is a picture of Charles Darwin. He was born in 1809, actually the same day as Abraham Lincoln across the Atlantic. He was born in 1809, and this is a wedding portrait done about 1839. So one thing I want to draw your attention to is that Darwin, this is a very good portrait. It's done by the best portraitist in England at the time. And that tells you something. The Darwin family could afford to do this. Darwin's grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, who was the potter. And that meant the Darwin family, and he married a first cousin, were very, very rich. I mean, they were, like I say, Silicon Valley rich. So what I want you to understand by this is I think Darwin was a great revolutionary, but you shouldn't think that he's going to be a rebel. I think what you're going to find is much that Darwin talks about comes from his past. In other words, he's not sitting in a garret in some unknown country like Hungary and saying, oh my God, I'm going to make the English uncomfortable. See what I'm going to do. That wasn't what he was about. He was very much part of the English establishment. Now, let's have the basic facts. He was born in 1809. He went on a voyage around the world, an English warship, which was doing studies of the coasts around South America because it was a big trading area, and so they needed good maps. He spent 5 years doing that. He did not become an evolutionist on the voyage, but he became one very shortly thereafter. And then towards the end of 1838, he discovered natural selection, the cause. And I should say straight off, Darwin was looking for a cause in biology, which would be equivalent to Newton's gravitational attraction in physics. So Darwin all the time was wanting to be, as it were, the Newtonian of biology. He sat on his ideas for 20 years, I think mainly because he knew they'd be very unpopular. And he finally published The Origin of Species in 1859. And then 12 years later, he published a book on our species, The Descent of Man. It deals with humans, but it's not in any sense a break from the Origin of Species. There are different emphases, but it's the same thinking. He didn't turn around and say, oh, I made a big mistake, now listen to what I've got to say. No, it wasn't. And he died in 1882. So most of his life, Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837. Most of his life, he was a Victorian, as we say in England. So that gives you an idea. But as I say, a very comfortable Victorian with a good family and everything like that. Now, Darwin was intending to become a clergyman, a clergyman in the Church of England. Why? Because you didn't have to be very hardworking to be a clergyman. You didn't have to be very intelligent to be a clergyman. But if you got a lot of money, you could get assistants, what we call in English curates, to do the work for you. And so it was a very good job for a gentleman to have. And that's what Darwin was. However, in 1831, that all got changed because he got the offer of going for 5 years around the world, and this is South America, on HMS Beagle. I should say he'd already at university, he'd started to collect beetles and things like that, and was attracting the attention of the scientists on campus. He did not do a biology degree because there were no biology degrees. He did sort of classics and theology like everybody else. So he was certainly known to be interested in biology. And I should say all his life, Darwin, although he was an amateur in the sense that he didn't have to work for it, all his life, Darwin was respected as a very professional scientist. He was part of the scientific community. There was never any question about that. So when Darwin published in 1859, they took him seriously because he was a well-known figure by then. And he'd also written a very popular travel book about the beagle. So everybody knew who Darwin was by the time he published in 1859. Now, as I say, he did not become an evolutionist on the voyage, but one thing in particular pushed him towards evolution. And this was his time at the Galapagos archipelago. This is a group of islands just off the coast of South America in the Pacific. They belong to Ecuador. And you can see the islands, they're 10, 20 miles apart, 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers apart. I mean, if you stand on one of them, you can see other islands from where you are. And what Darwin discovered, he didn't discover it. What he was told was that the tortoises on the different islands are similar, but different. And basically, Darwin said, why the hell did God do this? Did God so love tortoises that he put them on the different islands and made them different? Well, that doesn't make much sense. And so by the time he got back and started to think about it, he said, oh my goodness, it's evolution. And this is the first tree of life that we've got that Darwin drew. Now, as I say, this wasn't a break from Christianity or anything like that. By this time, Darwin had become what we in English call a deist, D-E-I-S-T, rather than a theist, T-H-E-I-S-T. Now, theo is Greek, is Latin for God, so they're the same. But a theist, Christian theist, has a God who's prepared to get involved with miracles. So he looks at Daniel and says, oh my goodness, wouldn't Daniel look better with a big head of hair just like Donald Trump? Whoomph! And Daniel looked like Donald Trump, a miracle like that. Whereas the deist says, no, why don't we give Daniel some kind of potion and then it will grow gradually according to the laws of nature over the next year. So when I do this talk again, I would say, oh, well, Donald, this is what I think, rather than that. So a deist it believes that God is working, but he's an unmoved mover rather than, I'll teach you to have a haircut before you talk. You come on with me, Daniel, I tell you. Okay, so he becomes an evolutionist in 1837. But as I said, the big, as it were, picture that he got in mind was, I want to be like Isaac Newton, who was the most famous scientist in England and also was a graduate of Cambridge University, where Darwin was. And what was Newton's big thing? The force of gravitational attraction, which then explained the Copernican revolution, Kepler's laws, Galileo, and all of this. So Darwin was looking for the biological equivalent of the gravitational attraction. At the end of September 1838, and the reason why we can be so exact is he kept these notebooks, and so we can tell almost to the hour when Darwin's doing things. And so he said, he came from England, he came from the center of England, agricultural England. He said, how do farmers change things? How do farmers breed pigs like this? Or sheep with very woolly hair? Or cows that have lots of food, lots of beef? They select. They start with regular piglets, they look at the fat piglets and they breed from those and kill off the ones that they don't want. And so Darwin knew that artificial selection was the key to change. The question was, how could he get a natural form of selection working in the world, which would be the equivalent of artificial selection? And at the end of September 38, he read a book by Thomas Robert Malthus, who was another clergyman. And Malthus was worried about the population explosion. At this time, it was the Industrial Revolution in England, and so numbers were going up dramatically. And Malthus said, what's going on? And Malthus said, God knows what he's going to do. Numbers go up, but there won't be enough food or space for them. So there will be at the top a struggle for existence. Now, Malthus thought that this was a good thing, that God had done this to make people, as it were, work hard rather than do nothing. I mean, I joke about my daughter. She majored in afternoon studies. She would get up after lunch. She would have breakfast. She would go to a couple of classes. She would come home, have supper, borrow $20 from me, and then all night until 3 in the morning, she'd be partying, at which time she went back to bed and it all. No, Malthus said, no, God doesn't want that. God wants people to work hard. And so there's going to be a struggle for existence. I should say, incidentally, my daughter is now a public defender, and she gets up at 8 o'clock on Saturday mornings to go and deal with people who are in trouble. So we all turn into our parents eventually. So Darwin said, there's a struggle for existence. There's always going to be variation in population. Some are going to be bigger, some will be smaller. Because of the struggle, only a few will survive, but more importantly, reproduce. Why are they good at reproducing? Because they're going to be stronger or whatever it is like that. I mean, you know, you've got, let's say, Ed versus Timaeus, and, you know, their struggle for existence. There's only a certain amount of space, but Ed turns out to be bigger, stronger, and more intelligent than Timaeus. So Ed's the one who survives and reproduces. And so the next generation are more like Ed than like Timaeus. And this is how evolution works. And this, for Darwin, is natural selection. And Darwin said, given enough time, this will lead to evolution, but more importantly, evolution of a particular kind, adaptive evolution. And these are Darwin's finches. These are some of the finches that Darwin would have seen on the Galapagos archipelago. And look at the finches and see what the most interesting characteristic of them is. It's that they've got very big, strong beaks, and they use these for cracking nuts. There are other finches with very fine beaks, which are insectivorous. They eat insects, and so they're adapted. Now, why did Darwin know about this? Because I remember what I told you. Darwin is part of upper middle class England. He'd gone to Cambridge. He'd gone to do theology. He was going to be a clergyman. And of course, then he read Archdeacon Paley's Natural Theology at the beginning, which was published at the beginning of the 19th century, which said the eye is like a telescope. Telescopes have telescope makers. Therefore, the eye has an eye maker. I mean, for those of you who are Catholic, this is Aquinas's fifth proof of the existence of God, the argument from design, or the teleological argument, as it's also known. And so Darwin had been brought up on this, So Darwin didn't want to deny adaptation. What he wanted to do was find a natural law explanation of it, rather than a God having to do miracles. And this is what I want to say. I think this is the real force of what Darwin did. He completed the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries was explaining the universe not through creation, not through guided laws like Aristotle, but through regular ordinary law. It didn't mean people were still Christians, but they wanted to say the way the world works doesn't require God. It goes according to unbroken law, an unmoved mover. So people were all moving to deism, which was what Darwin was doing. So what Darwin was doing was not denying adaptation, but what he was doing was explaining how all this happens without, boom, interventions of God or special laws, by regular laws. So this is what I mean by saying, I think Darwin completed the scientific revolution. And so in 1859, after some delay, he published on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. It was a bestseller from the beginning because everybody knew about Darwin. Everybody knew that Darwin was going to do this, and so when it came out, they bought it up, and immediately he was writing a second edition. So, in other words, what I'm saying to you is that this was not a secret. A year after, I'm sure you've all heard of Charles Dickens, the great novelist. Charles Dickens ran a weekly magazine in which he carried, bits and pieces and all of those. In 1860, Charles Dickens, in his magazine, had two lengthy articles about the origin of species, and they were quite favorable. At the end, they said, this may not be true, but seriously, folks, think hard about this, because this is a very reasonable, plausible science. So in other words, it wasn't, oh no, this is all false or anything like that. We all have the story of Thomas Henry Huxley debating with the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, about science versus religion. Yes, but not really. A lot of people had no problems about accepting at least evolution, if not natural selection. One of the things I like is they had biology degrees by this time at Cambridge. In 1851, the first exams said, show that evolution is false. By 1865, the exam said, assume the truth of evolution and now discuss the causes. In other words, people accepted evolution. They didn't feel it was a tense thing. And then, as I say, 12 years later, because everybody was talking about this, Darwin published his Descent of Man. I mean, there's some differences, some different emphases and that sort of thing. But basically, Darwin says we're monkeys, not monkeys that exist today, but monkeys, we are apes and we're evolved apes. Now, they didn't know how far back. I mean, today we know, for instance, that humans are more closely related to chimpanzees than chimpanzees are to gorillas. I mean, they didn't have DNA or ancient DNA or any of those sorts of things. But Darwin was quite convinced, and nobody wanted to question this, basically. Yeah, humans evolved. I mean, Christians wanted to say, yes, but God put an immortal soul into people. But remember, note, immortal souls are not scientific. In other words, you could do miracles if they weren't scientific. But if somebody said, yes, we just grow up or whatever it is, and then at some point God said, give them immortal souls, that's fine. But that's not a scientific issue. It's not something that you open up Daniel's brain and say, now, this party uses for teaching, this party uses for sex, big part, big, very big. And then over here, this is the immortal soul, very small, but it's there. No, it doesn't work that way. All right. So this was the origin of species, and this was what Darwin did. Now, let's start to talk a little more about the science-religion relationship and the whole question of design and teleology. Okay. So just to give you again one more bit of background, this is Darwin's religious life. I mean, it's not part of my argument, but he gives you an idea of where he's coming from. He grows up as an Anglican. Anglican is Church of England. The Wedgwood family were Unitarians. That means they didn't think that Jesus was God. They believed that Jesus was a very good person, but they denied what the Trinity. They did not believe in God, God, Jesus, and the Holy Ghost. They said it's all one God. So he was intending to be a clergyman, second down. And then, as I say, on the Beagle voyage, he dropped his Christianity, but he didn't become an atheist, never became an atheist. He believed in God as an unmoved mover. And when he writes The Origin of Species in 1859, he says this. He says, I think that evolution is of more credit to God than miracles. I think that a God who can do it all through unbroken law, who can get it all in motion and then make it work, is far superior to a God who has to keep interfering all the time. Now, a few years later, he becomes an agnostic, but that's mainly under the influence of people like Thomas Henry Huxley. And Darwin becomes an agnostic, not because of the science. One thing that worries him a great deal is that his father and also his older brother, Erasmus Darwin, were both non-believers. I mean, they were non-believers then. So both of them, I mean, if I don't know that they call themselves atheists, but basically that's what they were. And Darwin said, Christianity says, St. Paul says, if you don't have faith, if you don't believe, then, you know, everlasting fire and torment. And Darwin said, I cannot believe that my father and my brother, who are two of the finest people I've ever met, who are non-believers because of reasonable theological doubts, are going to go to hell because of that. He said, if that's what Christianity is, I don't want any part of it. And so that's why he became an agnostic, did not become an atheist. He never became an atheist, but he said, I just don't. No, I should say this was a very common pattern in the second half of the 19th century amongst intellectuals. Thomas Henry Huxley, George Eliot, the novelist, for instance, but also, you know, in America, people like Emily Dickinson and others, Haeckel in Germany, all of these people, agnosticism was the kind of way that they went. Not out, very few were atheists like Richard Dawkins. There were some, but very few. Most of them were agnostic and a sort of a middle position. And it doesn't mean that they were wishy-washy. They thought about it, and that's where they came out. So as I say, and then finally Darwin dies in 1882. But notice where he's buried. He's not buried in an unknown grave outside the city walls in disgrace. He's buried in Westminster Abbey, which is the leading church in England. It's where, you know, where the queens get crowned and that sort of thing. So Darwin is buried there. So notice then, Darwin is hugely respected, even if people didn't accept all of his ideas. People said, this is a great scientist and we're very proud of him and we want to honor him in that sort of way. So that gives you, as I say, I want you to get that kind of feeling. So the whole idea of, oh, it's just science versus religion like that. Yeah, it's not really true. It never really was true. I mean, there are stories about it, sure, clashes between Thomas Henry Huxley and Samuel Wilberforce, but by and large, this was, as it were, froth on the top. Most people were thinking hard about this. Even if they didn't become Darwinians, most of them became evolutionists. I mean, and that's the way it went. Now, what was the really important thing from the point of view of science and religion, from the point of view of teleology, from the point of view of thinking about these things in these sorts of terms? It was very much the argument from design. The world is so ordered and complex that it must have had a designer or a plan. Things seem to have a purpose. The eye is designed for seeing, which makes it seem that it was created. Those of you who know your history of philosophy will know that this argument first appears in the Phaedo by Plato. That's the story, that's the dialogue which deals with the last day of Socrates. He's about to have to drink the hemlock. And they're talking about, well, what's going to happen to you later? And Socrates says, well, I think there's going to be a life thereafter, but if there isn't, that's okay. And they say, why do you think there's going to be a life thereafter? And he says, the argument from design. He says, I look at things like the hand and the eye, and I just don't think they could have happened by chance. The only way I can think that they would have happened is through a designer. So this is the argument from design. And the argument from design means that something did it, and as I say, God did it, God done it. And so this is for all you atheists and others. This is God, okay? Looks a little bit like me. Anyhow, okay, except I have more clothes on than God. Okay, so as I say, this is the argument from design. Now, teleology, and I understand that this is something that am I right, Daniel? You're talking about this in the course. Okay, so I don't want you to come to the end of the talk and say, fantastic talk, but what the hell did it have to do with this course? I mean, you know, he might have talked about the sex life of Prince Andrew, which is interesting, but it has nothing to do with this course. So why is he talking about this? Well, because the argument for design is all about teleology. Teleology means explaining the present in terms of the future. What Aristotle calls final causes. Why are you, Timaeus, it's Saturday afternoon, everybody else is out watching a soccer match, and then they're going to have a few drinks and everything like that. Why, Timaeus, are you sitting in your study with textbooks out, calculus and biology texts and chemistry books? Why are you working like this now? And Timaeus says, because I want to get into medical school. In the future, I want to be a doctor and make a lot of money, whereas you will have to become professors and make no money. So in other words, I'm working now because I want to get into medical school in the future. In other words, the explanation is in the future of what's happening now. Now, what's wrong with that? And it's what second down, it's what philosophers call the problem of the missing goal object. What happens if Timaeus fails his exams and they say, Timaeus, I think you'd better be an ambulance driver instead, because I don't think you're good enough to be a doctor. So go and become an ambulance driver. So in other words, Timaeus is working hard today, but it doesn't work out. Okay, so this is the problem. You see, with regular courses, if I say, why is Daniel bald? Because he went to the hairdresser yesterday and the guy shaved him, then yeah, it happened yesterday, and so we've got today. So we don't have, we know that the barber shaving has already occurred and was real, whereas Timaeus working for getting to medical school might not happen. Now, how do you explain then teleological design argument? Either a designer like Plato, I am thinking, Timaeus says, I am thinking now about getting into medical school in the future, and that is what's making me work hard now. But of course, it's the thought now about the future, but it's the thought now which is making me work now. So there's no problem about missing goal object. Or Aristotle's argument is that somehow the laws of nature are teleologically designed to work towards the unmoved mover. And so even though Timaeus is working now, why is he working now? Because he's a subject of these forward-looking laws. So even if it doesn't work out, right now he's under the, as it were, the tyranny of the forward-working laws, and so we don't get into this problem. So this is the argument from design, and this is what it's got to do with teleology. Now, next question is, what then does Darwin have to do with this? Well, of course, what Darwin is going to do is he's going to try to give an explanation of adaptations. The eye, we have an eye now in order to look at, at the television this evening. So he wants to give explanation of final causes, but he wants to do it without talking about a designer, without talking about special laws. He wants to do it with regular laws, like Kepler's laws, or Galileo's laws, or just regular laws. Now, what Darwin says is an organism with a helpful variation now, better exercise, survives and reproduces better than an organism with lesser eyesight. So over generations, eyesight improves. So the teleological explanation is the eyes exist because they're going to work better in the future. However, the eyes exist even if the future doesn't work out. As I say, suppose the earth is covered in smoke, so nobody can see anything. So the eyes never do get to see. But why have we got the eyes? Why is it still appropriate to talk in terms of the eyes exist in order to see the television this evening? Because in the past, eyes existed in order to watch television. Last week, Daniel was sitting there and he said on Saturday morning, I'd like to watch television. I'd like to watch some television program very popular in England. Is Call the Midwife, all about midwives. So I want to watch, I've got my eyes now on Saturday morning. So on Saturday evening, I can sit at home with, with a cup of coffee or a beer or that sort of thing, and the door shut, and I can watch television, watch the midwife in the future. Now, okay, why is that a teleological explanation? Because last week, that's exactly what Daniel did. The week before, that's exactly what Daniel did. The week before, that's exactly what Daniel did. I mean, it's a wonder he got anywhere, but he spends week after week after week watching television on Saturday night. So we say now his eyes are, he has eyes in order to watch the television. Even if it doesn't work, we say this on the basis of what happened in the past. So we could be wrong. But of course, the designer, we could be wrong. The teleological laws, we could be wrong. So what Darwin is saying is, I am explaining teleology, explanations in the terms of the future, in terms of regular laws, not special laws. And how am I able to do this? Because cause and effect, cause and effect. Immanuel Kant spotted this. He wasn't the evolutionist, but he spotted this. The way it works is, in the past, Daniel watched television. He had eyes on Saturday morning. He watched television on Saturday evening. He had eyes on Saturday morning. He watched television on Saturday evening. Today, he has eyes on Saturday morning. What he's going to do tonight is watch television. That's why he's got the eyes. Then smoke happens and it doesn't work, but he still had the eyes. We still say he had the eyes in order to do this because of what happened in the past. I mean, if Daniel had never, ever used his eyes for watching television, then we could hardly say today that Daniel has eyes in order to watch television. We'd say, why do you say that? He never watches bloody television. You know, he never watches television. He'd rather sit down with a good book, works by Michael Ruse, the collected works of Michael Ruse, and on Saturday evening, he feels much happier reading the collected works of Michael Ruse than watching television. So, you know, what are you telling me? That he has eyes in order to watch television? Just not true. So, as I say, it's a teleological explanation in terms of regular laws, but it doesn't require a direct explanation to a designer or anything like that. Now, just stop right now. Does that mean atheism? No. Before Darwin, it was very difficult not to believe in some kind of God. Why? Because the world seems as if designed. If it's not designed by a designer, then you tell me how it's designed. And people, it's what in English we call an abductive or argument, or an argument to the best explanation. Something must have caused all those plants and eyes and everything. You tell me. The only answer that we've got is that God did it. Regular laws just lead to, you know, Murphy's law. Regular laws lead to things going wrong. So, you know, we can't appeal to regular laws. So what are we going to do? Appeal to God. Now Darwin says, no, you don't have to appeal to God. You can appeal to regular laws. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't exist, but it sure as hell means that you don't have to appeal to God. Richard Dawkins said one time, it makes it possible to be a justified atheist. Now, there may be other reasons why you're an atheist, but so this is what Darwin is doing. He's not making atheism, he's not proving atheism, but he's proving that you do not have to be a God believer anymore. That's what's going on. So does this prove God? Well, of course, having said that, for the rest of his life, Dawkins has been saying, yes, this does prove God. Now, so this is Richard Dawkins on the right. I should say, this is a picture of my wife. This is 1985, where my wife, I think, was 22 at the time. And this is Richard Dawkins, who would have been he'd have been about 45. So I should say I'm friends with Richard Dawkins, so it's okay. But so this is Richard Dawkins, who for the rest of his life has been saying, no, Darwinism shows God is wrong. And of course, the God delusion is all about that. Now the next one says, yes, Darwinism disproves God, which shows that Darwinism is wrong. You see, Richard Dawkins wants to say Darwinism disproves God, which shows that God is wrong. Now, creationist Dwayne T. Gish wants to say Darwinism disproves God, which shows that Darwinism is wrong. So this is Dwayne T. Gish, and he's the author of Evolution. His first book was Evolution, the Fossils Say No. And then he brought out a book saying Evolution, the Fossils Still Say No. This is Dwayne Gish. Funnily enough, I was a good friend of him too. I mean, he was a small man with a loud voice, And we just got on like a house on fire because we both like talking in public and we both like debating. And he didn't drink, but we like going for a cup of coffee or something afterwards and laughing about it and saying, I'd say, well, Dwayne, I hope you're going to go to heaven. And Dwayne says, I'm going to go to heaven, but God knows what's going to happen to you. God does know. So we were good friends. So this is Dwayne Gish. So the final one is saying, no, Darwinism disproves God. No, it doesn't disprove God. No, it doesn't disprove God. It might make God not obligatory, but there could well be very good other reasons why we want to believe in God. And this was the position of John Henry Newman, who began as an Anglican at Church of England at the beginning of the 19th century, and then converted to Catholicism and became a cardinal. And this is John Henry Newman, and he said it makes it possible to be an atheist, not obligatory. And he said, I believe in design because I believe in God. I do not believe in God because I believe in design. And I think that's a wonderful quote. And the number of times I have used that as an exam question. Quote, I believe in design because I believe in God. I do not believe in God because I believe in design. Comment, discuss. I think it's a wonderful question because you've got to think about what on earth Newman is talking about and those sort of things. Very, very, very thoughtful thinker, John Henry Newman. As an aside, it's also pretty clear that he's gay. He was gay. And so a lot of gays, certainly in England, look upon Newman. He's now a saint, and they look upon Newman as the sort of he's the saint of gay people. I'm not sure that Newman would have been that pleased with that, but anyhow, so as I say, if you think about Newman, he's the saint of gays, just like, other saints deal with other things. All right. Okay. So now the question is, where do we come out at the end? I'm drawing to the end of what I want to talk. So I think there are two ways that you can go at this. One, and of course, this is Christianity has always had this, faith and reason. It's always been a question of faith and reason. Sometimes the emphasis has been on faith, sometimes the emphasis has been on reason. But generally, Christians want to say we've got both. I mean, all students, certainly all students in England and America who do philosophy have had Aquinas's 5 arguments extracted in a book, and they discuss them. And they think that Aquinas only believes in what we call natural theology, explanations of God through reason and evidence. No, in fact, what Aquinas says is faith is much more important. We've got reason, we can get at God, but faith is much more important. Why? Because without faith, lazy people and ignorant people would never know about God. Somebody who's not very clever cannot follow the arguments, but they've still got to be able to get to God. And so we need faith. We also need faith for things that natural theology can't prove, like the Trinity. Natural theology cannot prove that God is 3 in 1, but he is 3 in 1, but we get this from faith. So faith is that. The other side is somebody who works just from reason like this. And what I'm trying to say, note that none of these arguments have anything to do with Darwin. Now, why would somebody think that faith would work? Usually because they've had some kind of vision. Something has happened to them that suddenly they say something that beautiful, that important, that whatever it is, transcendent, has to mean something. And although I don't think I'm a Christian, there are times when I listen to Mozart, and when I listen to Mozart, and particularly, I don't have it. When I go back, when I listen to Mozart, I say, oh my goodness me, this is transcendent. I think I told you, what I truly love is Mozart's The Magic Flute, the Zauberflöte, that he wrote in the last year of his life, 1791. And the priest, Sarastro, sings within these holy walls, love and forgiveness exists. And I have to say, from the age of 16, when I first heard that aria, it shook me. It really shook me. And I said, it's all very well saying God doesn't exist, but if this kind of a transcendent beauty can exist, there has to be some meaning. Now, as I say, I think this is a perfectly legitimate argument. It's not an argument. It's an appeal to faith. Faith is something that you don't, as it were, you don't do on your own. It's something that's given to you. You've got to be ready. You've got to be receptive to it. If you never go to the opera, you're not going to get it. If you're not prepared to be open, but faith is something that's given to you. But it has nothing, as I say, to do with Darwinism. The other argument is pain. And this, of course, is the argument that, oh my God, if God is all loving and God is all powerful, then how on earth do we have pain? Why do we have pain? Why do people suffer like this? And of course, there are various arguments, but I think a good argument is that if God wanted to get adaptation, if God wanted to get eyes and hands and things like that, God can't make 2 + 2 = 5. God has to work according to the laws of nature. He can't just be arbitrary about it. Being all powerful doesn't mean to say you can do the impossible. As I say, because you're all powerful, you cannot make 2 + 2 = 5. And what the argument goes, of course, God wanted the hand and the eye. The only way that he could get it is through the struggle for existence, which is going to lead to pain, which is going to lead to things leading to pain. So in other words, pain is, as it were, something that comes with the territory. Again, far from Darwinism disproving this, Darwinism, of course, if anything, supports it. So both ways I want to argue that today, if you want to believe on faith, you don't have to, but if you want to believe on faith, I don't see that Darwinism has a fight in this. But on the other hand, if you don't want to believe, then I think far better than trying to use Darwin against God, is far better is to use theological questions like Darwin did and say, I cannot believe that, as St. Paul says, that if you don't believe, you're going to go to hell. I mean, that, you know, there's something really wrong about, let's say, believing, as we all know, people who don't have any moral integrity that go to church, and people who have huge moral integrity but say, I just can't believe, I just can't believe. And if God says, oh, well, because they went to church, they're going to go to heaven, and because they didn't go to church, they're going to go to hell, I think that's a good theological reason to reject God. I'm not telling you you must. I'm saying this is a good reason why one might want to. But notice that this, just as the other, has nothing to do with Darwinism. It doesn't prove Darwinism. So as I come to the end of my talk, this is Darwin, who was buried in Westminster Abbey. And as I say, I think that was legitimate. Darwin was not an anti-Christian. Darwin was not an atheist. Darwin was not Richard Dawkins. I mean, if Richard Dawkins was buried in Westminster Abbey, I think we'd all say that was not appropriate. That was not right. I think Dawkins would say that. I think Dawkins, but certainly. But Darwin wasn't like that. Darwin, as I say, became an agnostic. He was earlier, first of all, he was a theist, then he was a deist, then later he became an agnostic, never an atheist. And Darwin always saw that his theory was important. And if anything, of course, a lot of people said, what did God give us to make us in the image of God? Moral sense and intellectual sense. And if the intellect and reason leads us to this, then we must accept it. This is the argument of St. Augustine, 400 AD. So, as I say, a lot of people would say, yes, an honest doubter like Darwin, it's perfectly appropriate that he be buried in Westminster Abbey. And that, I think, is the end. Goodness, how long have I taken? Yes, that, I think, is basically the end of my talk. That's all, folks.